The City of London has always had two sides, the one the tourists see, and the one the law tries to forget. Beneath the bright lights of Soho and the polished charm of the West End, there was a time when fear had a face. In fact, it had two. Ronnie and Reggie Kray, twin brothers from the bomb-damaged streets of the East End, became the most feared men in Britain. They didn't just run the underworld. For a while, they were the underworld. They built their empire from smoke-filled clubs, shady deals, and the kind of violence that made grown men whisper their names. But what made the Krays truly dangerous wasn't just their fists or their guns, it was their image. They learned early that fear could be packaged, sold and worn like a suit. Sharp clothes, clean speech and charm that fooled both the elite and the police. They played the role of gentlemen, but behind every handshake was a threat. The story that most people know, the one shown in films and TV shows, is all glamour and grit. Gangsters in tailored suits, champagne in nightclubs, and the illusion of control. But the truth is much darker. The Krays didn't fall because of the police or the press. They fell because of what was happening behind closed doors, paranoia, betrayal, and a mind that was slipping into madness. In the 1950s, they were just two kids trying to escape poverty. By the 1960s, they were dining with celebrities and shaking hands with politicians. London's elite welcomed them. Newspapers adored them, and for a while they looked unstoppable. But the same fame that built them would soon destroy them. The city that once bowed to their name would eventually turn against them, piece by piece, until their empire crumbled under its own weight. What you're about to hear isn't another glorified gangster story. This is the real truth, the version no one dared to film. It's not about heroes or villains. It's about two brothers who rose too high, too fast, and brought themselves down long before the police ever arrived. Their story isn't just a chapter in British crime history. It's a warning about power, pride, and the illusion of control. Because in the world the Krays built, loyalty came with a price, and fear only worked until the first man stopped being afraid. And when that happened, everything, the money, the power, the reputation started to collapse. This is how it really happened. The rise, the madness, and the fall of the Kray twins. The truth they never showed on TV. East London after the war was a broken place, pretending to heal. The air still smelled of smoke and brick dust. The nights were quieter than they should have been, and everyone seemed to be rebuilding something: homes, businesses, reputations. The old docks and warehouses had been hit hard during the Blitz, leaving behind empty spaces where factories once stood. Out of that rough soil, a new kind of generation grew up, proud, angry, and unwilling to bow to anyone. Ronnie and Reggie Kray were born into that world. The streets taught them everything schools couldn't. Their mother, Violet, was protective, the kind of East End woman who could calm a fight with a look and a cup of tea. Their father, Charles, was a tradesman who spent long stretches at sea, leaving the twins to carve their own order among the chaos. Even as boys, the Krays had that mix of charm and menace that would later make them famous. Teachers called them polite one day and impossible the next. They loved boxing, the one legal way to fight your way out of poverty. In local halls they learned how to take a punch, how to read an opponent's fear, and how a quick smile after a hit could unnerve a crowd. The East End in the early 50s was full of small-time rackets, black market cigarettes, stolen ration coupons, pubs that doubled as betting shops. To survive, you either paid protection or offered it. The twins started as local toughs collecting debts for older men, learning fast that violence was currency. They weren't the biggest gang around, but they were the most disciplined. Ronnie's temper made people step back. Reggie's quiet control made them listen. The combination worked like a business model. They didn't just fight, they organized. Their first base of power was a snooker club in Bethnal Green. It was more than a place to play. It became the meeting point for bookmakers, petty thieves, and anyone who wanted safety from other gangs. The Krays charged a fee for that safety, and if anyone refused, they made an example of them. Slowly, their territory grew from one street to several. People began to talk about the boys. Police reports started mentioning their names in connection with robberies and assaults, but witnesses disappeared or changed their stories. They opened more clubs, legitimate on paper, but run with iron rules. Dress sharp, pay respect, and don't cause trouble unless told to. Their mother's influence lingered. Even the roughest men spoke politely to Violet Kray. She became a strange moral anchor in a world of crime, and the twins made sure no one disrespected her. That loyalty to family was part of their strength. They sold it as a code, something higher than money. In a time when most criminals turned on each other, the Krays promised unity. By the mid-50s, national service took most young men into the army. The twins went too, but the military didn't know what to do with them. Within weeks, they were in trouble for fighting, bullying officers, and eventually assaulting a corporal who tried to discipline them. They spent most of their service behind bars, escaped once, were recaptured, and finally discharged dishonorably. The army had tried to break them. Instead, it gave them more pride in defiance. Back in London, they were local legends, the boys who took on the army and walked out smiling. Opportunity grew with reputation. Britain's nightlife was changing. The war was over, rationing was fading, and people wanted glamour. West End clubs filled with businessmen, actors, and politicians chasing excitement. The Krays saw a gap. Gangsters who could blend into that world, not just crash it. They started investing their takings into nightclubs and gambling dens, always keeping a respectable front. To the public, they were young entrepreneurs from the East End. To the underworld, they were rising fast. Billy Hill, one of London's top racketeers, noticed them. He saw potential and danger in equal measure. For a time, he used them as muscle and advisors, teaching them how large-scale crime worked, how to handle police payoffs, how to launder money, how to keep lawyers and accountants close. The Krays watched and learned. When Hill retired from most of his operations, they stepped into the gap he left behind. Ronnie was already changing. Prison time and pressure amplified his paranoia. He saw insults where none were meant, betrayal in casual talk. Reggie, on the other hand, refined himself. He studied how wealthy men dressed and spoke, buying tailored suits, cufflinks and rings. The twins began to represent two sides of one empire, the charm and the threat. Their name started to mean something beyond fear. It meant order. If the Krays ran your club, you were safe from every other gang in London because none of them dared to challenge the twins directly. Their empire expanded through the mid-50s. Protection rackets stretched from East End pubs to West End casinos. They took cuts from black market deals, arranged robberies, and invested in real businesses to clean the profits. Every week, cash moved through their network like blood through veins. They hired drivers, doormen, and bodyguards, many of them former boxers or soldiers who needed work and respected authority. At the same time, they understood the value of public image. They began appearing at charity events, donating small sums, shaking hands with local officials. Photographs showed them smiling beside community leaders. Newspapers wrote small features about the well-dressed Kray brothers. The line between celebrity and criminal blurred. For London's elite, having the Krays in your club was a thrill. For the police, it was a frustration. Everyone knew what they were, but no one could make a case stick. Violence never disappeared. It simply moved behind closed doors. When someone refused to pay or talk too much, they were invited for a chat. Those who came back stayed silent. Those who didn't were rarely mentioned again. Yet, even the victims admitted that the twins kept their word once deals were made. In an era where most gangsters were unpredictable, the Krays followed a code. If you paid, you were safe. That reliability made them powerful. Their family home in Valence Road became a symbol. Visitors described the strange mixture of domestic warmth and menace, Violet serving tea while armed men discussed territory at her kitchen table. Photographs of the twins in suits hung beside religious icons. It was as if crime and family life had fused into one. The East End adored them because they represented success without surrendering identity. They were still our boys, only richer, sharper, and untouchable. But success carried a cost. Ronnie's outbursts became harder to control. Reggie spent increasing time smoothing things over. Their younger brother, Charlie, tried to act as peacemaker, keeping business steady. The more power they gained, the more attention they attracted. Journalists started linking them to violent incidents. Politicians whispered about corruption. Yet the police remained cautious. The Krays had friends in high places and a reputation for retaliation. Through careful intimidation and public charm, they entered the West End fully. They acquired Esmeralda's Barn, a fashionable nightclub in Knightsbridge, and began mixing with actors, singers, and even members of the aristocracy. The contrast was stunning. Two men from the bombed-out East End now drinking champagne beside lords and film stars. For the twins, it was validation proof that fear and ambition could open any door in Britain. Still, the cracks were there. The same qualities that made them rise were beginning to divide them. Ronnie's obsession with dominance led him to challenge rival gangs directly, even when unnecessary. He wanted to be seen as invincible. Reggie wanted control, structure, and quiet money. He often cleaned up the chaos Ronnie left behind. People within the organization started choosing sides, though none dared admit it aloud. The mid-60s London underworld was shifting from fists to finance. Drugs, property, and international smuggling were becoming the new frontier. The Krays, rooted in old-school intimidation, sensed the change but resisted it. They believed reputation alone could keep them on top. It did for a while. They had money, fame, and a network of loyal men, but also police surveillance, jealous rivals, and the slow poison of internal mistrust. By the end of the decade's first half, the brothers were everywhere. Newspapers called them the bosses of the East End. They sat in the front row at boxing matches, their entourage filling whole sections of seats. Flashbulbs followed them as if they were movie stars. People who once feared them began to admire them. That was both victory and downfall in one. The myth of the Krays became larger than the reality, and the reality was beginning to slip. What no one saw behind the photographs was how fragile their empire already was. The same friends who toasted them in clubs also whispered to detectives. Some of their oldest allies started to wonder how long they could survive under Ronnie's unpredictable temper. Reggie's attempts at diplomacy only delayed the inevitable. They were climbing higher, but the higher they went, the thinner the air became. The rise of the Kray twins wasn't a fairy tale of ambition. It was a slow construction of fear disguised as respect. Every handshake came with an unspoken threat. Every favor demanded repayment, and every night out carried the risk of violence. Yet for more than a decade, it worked. The twins had turned post-war poverty into power, criminality into culture, and their own names into a brand recognized across Britain. London belonged to them, or so it seemed. They walked through their clubs like kings, bodyguards clearing a path, flashbulbs lighting their faces. But in every empire built on fear, there comes a moment when people stop being afraid, and that moment was getting closer. The police were watching, rivals were waiting, and the cracks in the brothers' partnership were widening with every passing night. Their story up to this point was one of victory. What came next would be the beginning of their unravelling, a slow, bloody descent that proved no amount of fame or loyalty can protect a man from himself. By the early 1960s, the Kray twins had turned from East End hard men into the most recognisable faces of the British underworld. They owned clubs across London, moved through high society with ease, and had the police second-guessing every move. Their photograph was in the newspapers almost weekly, always smiling, always perfectly dressed. But behind the cameras, their empire was becoming unstable, built on loyalty that was cracking, and a brotherhood that was beginning to rot from the inside. The West End was their stage now. The twins spent most nights at Esmeralda's barn, their Knightsbridge club filled with movie stars, singers and gamblers. On the surface, it looked glamorous. Expensive suits, champagne flowing, laughter over jazz. But the smiles were forced. Everyone knew violence sat at the next table. Reggie controlled the business side, keeping the books balanced, and the police on a leash through payoffs. Ronnie, however, wanted more than money. He wanted recognition. To him, fear was respect, and respect meant control. Ronnie's temper had grown unpredictable. He had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, though most around him didn't understand what that meant. Some nights he was charming, telling jokes and treating guests like royalty. Other nights he stared in silence, seeing threats in every whisper. He carried a revolver almost everywhere, claiming enemies were plotting against them. When friends tried to calm him, he took it as betrayal. Reggie kept trying to protect his brother, excusing his behaviour, smoothing things over with people who were terrified. But privately, Reggie was exhausted. Still, the Krays' reach only grew. They built a reputation as the men who could make anything happen. Need protection for a club? Call the Krays. Want to host an illegal card game without police interference? The Krays could arrange it. They were businessmen of the underground, their front polished, their methods brutal. Everyone who mattered knew they controlled London east of the Thames. Their name became currency. celebrities started appearing with them for publicity, some out of fascination, others out of fear. The twins were photographed with Frank Sinatra's entourage, with film stars, with politicians who pretended not to know their background. It was fashionable to know the Krays, to say you'd been to one of their clubs. They blurred the line between fame and infamy so effectively that half the city couldn't tell the difference anymore. But the glamour masked the paranoia. Ronnie believed rival gangs were conspiring with the police to bring them down. He started forming alliances with men just as violent as himself. One of them was Mad Frankie Fraser, another notorious enforcer. They drank together, talked about power, and fantasized about creating their own version of the American Mafia. Ronnie liked to call it the Firm, a family built not on blood, but on loyalty through fear. The Firm wasn't just a gang. It was a network of criminals, ex-boxers, and small-time businessmen who owed the twins favors or money. Each man had his place. Collectors, enforcers, drivers, fixers. The Krays ran it like an army. But discipline in an army depends on leadership, and the twins were drifting apart. Reggie still believed in control. Ronnie believed in domination. When Ronnie wanted to prove strength, he didn't wait for reason. He shot, stabbed, or ordered someone beaten. Reggie cleaned up the aftermath, arranging alibis, paying off witnesses. Their influence reached deep into politics and the police. Some officers took bribes to look the other way. Others were simply scared. The Krays knew too much about everyone. Through gossip in clubs and whispers from clients, they learned who was cheating on whom, who was gambling too much, who had secrets worth hiding. They stored that knowledge like weapons. Anyone who tried to challenge them suddenly found their private life splashed across the papers, or their business raided for unrelated reasons. The Krays didn't just use fists, they used information. Still, the cost of being everywhere was exposure. The press started connecting names and incidents. A journalist named Laurie O'Leary, once a friend, began documenting their activities more openly. The police set up special squads to investigate organized crime, something Britain had rarely done before. Scotland Yard's detectives watched their every move, but waited patiently, knowing they needed witnesses who wouldn't vanish. Inside the firm, cracks appeared. Some members, like Albert Donahue and Tony Lambrianou, began to notice that loyalty meant less than Ronnie's moods. Punishments for minor mistakes became savage. Beatings in the back rooms of their clubs were routine. Once, when Ronnie thought someone had disrespected him by refusing a drink, he smashed a glass in the man's face in front of everyone. No one intervened. That night, the message was clear. The Krays weren't men you refused. Reggie tried to maintain appearances. He invested in real estate, kept accountants busy hiding their cash flow, and met quietly with solicitors to prepare for inevitable legal challenges. He was a thinker, not a planner, but he understood survival depended on stability. His dream was to become a legitimate businessman, using their wealth to escape the criminal world. But Ronnie was addicted to power. He didn't want to leave the streets. He wanted to own them. Their fame reached its peak around 1964. Magazines printed their photos beside actors and models. Women admired their looks. Men copied their style. But to those who really knew them, the glamour was an act. Their charm hid fear. Their parties masked paranoia. The twins were no longer running the underworld. They were trying to control the narrative of their own myth. That myth began to collapse when violence stopped being selective. The blind beggar pub shooting in Whitechapel marked a shift. The victim, George Cornell, was part of the rival Richardson gang from South London. He had mocked Ronnie publicly days earlier, calling him a fat poof. Ronnie never forgot an insult. On the night of March 9th, 1966, he walked into the crowded pub wearing a suit and overcoat. Without a word, he pulled out his gun and shot Cornell in the head. Witnesses froze, but no one moved to stop him. He simply turned and walked out. That moment changed everything. Until then, the Krays had kept their violence behind closed doors. But now they had murdered a man in front of an entire pub. Word spread fast. The press called it a gangland execution. Scotland Yard called it the break they'd been waiting for. But on the streets, no one would talk. Everyone who saw it swore they hadn't. Fear still ruled. Reggie knew it was a disaster. He begged Ronnie to stay quiet, to stop drawing attention. But Ronnie was proud of it. He bragged openly about killing Cornell, claiming he'd done what others were too scared to do. To him, it was proof of dominance. To everyone else, it was proof he'd lost control. The firm grew restless. Some members wanted out. Others saw opportunity in the chaos. The Richardson gang, their main rivals, were already under pressure from police. The Krays thought they could take full control of London. Reggie planned new deals, new investments, but Ronnie sabotaged everything with unpredictability. He started surrounding himself with men who fueled his ego, dangerous, reckless people who encouraged his delusions. Meanwhile, Reggie's private life was falling apart. He had married Frances Shea, a young woman from their neighbourhood. She was beautiful, quiet, and too gentle for the world the twins lived in. Reggie adored her, but couldn't escape the shadow of his family or his brother. Frances grew depressed, isolated by the violence and control around her. In 1967, she took her own life. Reggie never truly recovered. Her death became a wound that turned his ambition into bitterness. After Frances's death, Reggie became colder, more mechanical. He followed Ronnie's lead in violence more often, losing the restraint that once set them apart. The twins began acting not as businessmen, but as enforcers again. They drank more, trusted less, and lashed out faster. London's elite, once amused by their presence, started keeping their distance. The Krays were no longer a thrilling story. They were a threat that could ruin reputations. Police pressure increased. Detectives built profiles, tracking associates, mapping the structure of the firm. Every phone call, every visit, every whispered conversation in a club was noted. The Krays didn't realize how closely they were being watched. They still believed fear protected them. But the climate in London was shifting. Younger criminals weren't afraid anymore. They saw the Krays as old-fashioned bullies, clinging to fading power. Inside their empire, betrayal brewed quietly. Men who had once killed for them began cooperating with detectives. Some were tired of living under constant threat. Others saw prisoners safer than loyalty. Scotland Yard found its first informants and began piecing together the real structure of the firm. For the first time, evidence was more than rumours. The law was closing in. The public image that had once made the Krays invincible now made them targets. Newspapers started publishing exposés. Headlines called them Britain's gang lords and untouchable twins. The more the press wrote, the more the police were pressured to act. Politicians couldn't afford to ignore them anymore. In secret meetings, senior officers planned what they called Operation Countryman, a long-term strategy to dismantle organised crime in London. The Krays were at the top of the list. But the twins didn't see it coming. They were too busy protecting pride. Reggie kept chasing business deals that never worked. Ronnie chased respect through fear. Every night they held meetings in their clubs, planning their next move, unaware that some of those present were already passing information to detectives. Their empire looked powerful from the outside, but inside it was hollow, a kingdom held together by habit and history. The turning point was approaching, though neither brother could see it clearly. Their power, built on fear and loyalty, had reached its limit. Ronnie's paranoia would soon trigger the event that ended everything. For now, the twins still walked through London as kings, but the ground beneath them was beginning to crack. They had built their world through fists, charm, and reputation. But by the late 1960s, those tools no longer worked. The people who once bowed now whispered behind their backs. The law that once feared them was preparing to strike. What had started as two brothers chasing respect in a broken city had become a slow march towards self-destruction. Every empire ends the same way, first in silence, then in a fall that everyone sees coming except the men at the top. The Krays still thought they ruled London. In truth, London was already learning how to live without them. By the late 1960s, the Kray twins were no longer just underworld figures. They were living ghosts haunting their own legend. Everyone in London knew their names. Some still feared them, some secretly mocked them, but no one ignored them. Behind the glamour and the tailored suits, the empire they built was cracking under its own weight. Loyalty was fading, money was disappearing, and their brotherhood, once their greatest weapon, was turning into their greatest weakness. Violence had always been part of their language, but now it was the only language they spoke. The twins had become isolated, surrounded by men who said yes to everything, too afraid to speak the truth. Ronnie's mind was unravelling fast. He heard voices, saw threats in shadows, and trusted no one but Reggie. He believed rivals were plotting assassinations. The police informants were everywhere. His paranoia became so extreme that he slept with a loaded gun by his bed and ordered bodyguards to check the house every hour. Reggie, on the other hand, was trapped between loyalty and exhaustion. He had spent his life cleaning up his brother's chaos, smoothing over fights, bribing witnesses and keeping the firm together. But after Francis's death, something inside him broke. The man who once planned every move now moved through life like a ghost himself, calm on the surface, empty underneath. He still dressed the part, still shook hands and smiled for the cameras, but his world had lost meaning. The empire they'd built no longer felt like power. It felt like a cage. The police investigations were tightening. Detectives had spent months collecting small pieces sightings, phone records, witness statements whispered through fear. They didn't need the twins to make mistakes. They just needed patience. But the Krays couldn't stay still. They were too used to controlling everything, too proud to sense the danger closing in. Their response to every threat was the same as always: violence. That was their undoing. The first major crack came with the murder of George Cornell. Ronnie had already made himself a target by killing Cornell in front of witnesses. The case was alive, but fragile. No one would testify. Still, Scotland Yard's Major Crime Squad quietly built a file. Every time Ronnie boasted, every time someone repeated a story from a pub, it went into the report. They waited for one more act of madness to make the case unbreakable. It came from Reggie. Among their circle was Jack the Hat McVitie, a small-time criminal, loud and unreliable, who worked for the firm collecting debts. He had a habit of drinking too much and running his mouth. Reggie tolerated him because Jack had once been useful. But when McVitie started missing payments and talking about the twins behind their backs, Ronnie insisted he be dealt with. Reggie wanted to warn him. Ronnie wanted to make an example. The result was disaster. In October 1967, the firm gathered for what was supposed to be a party in Stoke Newington. The room was filled with their closest associates, men who had followed the twins for years, some already planning their escape. Reggie arrived late, quiet, withdrawn. Ronnie was tense, pacing. Jack McVitie showed up drunk, laughing, unaware he was walking into his death. Accounts of what happened that night vary, but the result never changed. Ronnie insulted him, McVitie talked back, and Reggie snapped. He pinned McVitie to the floor, screaming about respect, about betrayal, about how no one could talk about the Krays like that. Then he pulled out a knife and stabbed him again and again. The room went silent except for the sound of Reggie's breathing. Blood soaked the carpet. The man they once called a friend was dead. That murder changed everything. Until that night, most of their violence had been calculated brutal, yes, but strategic. This was different. It was personal, sloppy, and witnessed by half a dozen of their own men. It showed weakness, not power. The firm that once saw them as leaders now saw them as liabilities. Every man in that room understood that the police would come eventually, and when they did, someone would have to talk. The Krays ordered the body removed, buried quietly in a field, but the damage was done. Rumours spread fast through the underworld. People who had once sworn loyalty started vanishing. Some fled the country. Others went to the police. Scotland Yard, now confident they had enough, intensified surveillance. They bugged phones, followed cars, intercepted messages. The Krays thought they were still in control, but their empire was being mapped in real time. Meanwhile, Ronnie's behaviour spiralled beyond repair. He grew obsessed with his own mythology. He started talking about becoming Britain's version of Al Capone, claiming the firm would outlive politics itself. He invited photographers to his clubs, posing like a celebrity, while detectives watched from cars outside. To the public, he was part of London's folklore, a dangerous man dressed like a gentleman. To the police, he was a ticking bomb. Reggie couldn't stop him. The bond that once made them unbeatable was now a chain dragging them both down. Reggie still handled the money, the front businesses, the lawyers, but none of it mattered. He was covering cracks that couldn't be hidden anymore. Every time he looked at his brother, he saw the collapse coming. Ronnie no longer trusted him fully either. He accused Reggie of plotting against him, of siding with traitors. Their conversations became tense, filled with silent suspicion. Those around them began choosing sides. Some followed Reggie, believing he still had a plan. Others stuck with Ronnie out of fear. But both sides were sinking. The police had their informants now, People inside the firm who gave names, locations, details of meetings, even the names of the murdered. For the first time, detectives had real witnesses who weren't terrified into silence. Scotland Yard prepared to strike. In early 1968, coordinated raids swept across London. Officers kicked down doors, arrested known associates, seized documents, weapons and cash. The Krays were taken into custody without resistance. Cameras captured their arrest. Two men in immaculate suits walking calmly into police cars, faces unreadable. It was the image that marked the end of an era. Even in custody, they acted like celebrities. They smiled for reporters, waved to photographers, and treated the station like a stage. But the law was different now. They weren't facing beat cops who could be bought or intimidated. They were facing detectives who had built a case piece by piece, witness by witness. Scotland Yard had statements from their own men. Men like Leslie Payne, their business manager, who turned informant after realizing loyalty meant nothing when your life was at risk. The trial that followed was one of the most publicized in British history. The prosecution laid out the murders of George Cornell and Jack McVitie in detail, supported by witnesses who described every scene. The Krays' defense tried to paint them as misunderstood businessmen, victims of police obsession, but the evidence was overwhelming. The courtroom atmosphere was tense, half theatre, half reckoning. The twins sat calmly through it all, often smiling, sometimes whispering to each other, as if the outcome didn't matter. But the verdict did matter. Life imprisonment, with a recommendation that they never be released. The crowd outside the Old Bailey erupted when it was announced. For the first time, the myth of the untouchable Krays was shattered. The same papers that once glamorized them now printed their mugshots under headlines about murder and madness. The empire was gone, replaced by silence. Ronnie was sent to Broadmoor Hospital, declared criminally insane. There, he spent the rest of his life medicated and watched, his mind fading in and out of delusion. He continued to believe he was a king among men, writing letters and giving interviews from his cell, insisting he'd done nothing wrong except live by his own rules. Reggie went to prison, where he tried to hold on to dignity. He read books, exercised, and kept his distance from other inmates. But he was no longer feared. The power that once defined him had no place behind bars. The firm dissolved quickly after their imprisonment. Some members turned to smaller crimes, others disappeared. The name Kray still carried weight, but it was now a memory, a story parents told their kids about the days when London's underworld wore suits. In the streets they once ruled, new gangs rose younger, more ruthless, less loyal. The Krays were history before they even realized it. Yet the fascination never ended. Films, books, documentaries all retold their story, often twisting it into something glamorous again. But the truth was simpler and sadder. The twins weren't brought down by rivals or police genius. They were brought down by themselves, by pride, paranoia, and the illusion that fear could last forever. The murders of Cornell and McVitie weren't just crimes, they were confessions. Each killing was a mirror showing what they'd become. Their fall changed the face of British crime. The underworld that came after them learned to stay invisible, less noise, more profit, no fame. The Krays had shown what happened when gangsters started believing their own legend. For the city, their conviction was the end of the gangster as celebrity. For the twins, it was the end of everything. Terms? Years later, Reggie would say in an interview that he didn't regret much except the people he trusted. It was a half-truth. What he couldn't admit was that without Ronnie, he wouldn't have risen. But because of Ronnie, he could never have survived. The brothers who ruled together couldn't exist apart. In prison visits, they spoke quietly, sometimes laughing about old times, sometimes sitting in silence. Whatever they were murderers, brothers, legends, they remained connected until the end. When Ronnie died in 1995, Reggie was allowed to attend the funeral under guard. He stood beside the grave, head bowed, the last king of a vanished empire. When he himself died 5 years later, the Kray story finally closed, not with violence, but with silence. Their names live on because London never forgot the contradiction, the polished manners hiding brutality, the loyalty that ended in betrayal, the fame that became their downfall. The real story isn't about how they rose. It's about how two brothers mistook fear for respect, and how that mistake cost them everything. The blood they spilled didn't make them powerful. It made them prisoners long before the police arrived. That's the truth. Television never showed, not the glamour, not the headlines, but the slow decay of two men who built their own cage and locked themselves inside it. Prison didn't end the Kray twins' story. It only changed the stage. Behind bars, they remained famous. But fame means something different when you can't walk outside. The newspapers still wrote their names, the old photographs still circled on TV, and visitors still came, chasing a glimpse of the legend. But the reality was far less glamorous. The twins who once ruled London's underworld now woke up to the sound of prison bells, ate the same food as everyone else, and followed the same rules they had once mocked. The empire had become a memory, and even that was starting to fade. Reggie Kray was sent to Maidstone prison to serve life for murder. He carried himself with quiet discipline, never showing weakness, always polite with guards. He worked out daily, read history books, and wrote letters to anyone who would listen. To some, he still seemed dangerous calm, watchful, and sharp. But to those who saw him closely, he was a man searching for meaning in a place where time had no shape. He often spoke of his brother, half proud, half tired, as if he still couldn't separate loyalty from regret. Ronnie, on the other hand, was sent to Broadmoor Hospital, declared criminally insane. There, he lived among the violent and the broken men whose crimes had crossed the line between cruelty and madness. For Ronnie, that world felt familiar. He had long believed himself different, a man above law and morality. In Broadmoor, he became a kind of celebrity patient, unpredictable, charming and dangerous all at once. The staff learned to keep their distance. Some days he was polite, speaking about his past like an old actor, remembering his roles. Other days he was lost in delusions, convinced he was still the boss of London. Even in separation, the bond between the twins didn't fade. They wrote letters, sent messages through visitors, and occasionally were allowed brief meetings. Those who saw them together said it was like watching two halves of the same mirror. Reggie was controlled and quiet. Ronnie was manic and restless. They would argue, laugh, and then sit in silence, trapped by time, each carrying the weight of the past in a different way. Outside prison walls, the world moved on. London changed faster than they could imagine. The East End they once ruled was rebuilt, its bomb-damaged streets replaced by glass towers and new money. The smoky pubs where deals were made turned into trendy bars. The old gangland replaced by corporate power. The criminal world itself had evolved. Where the Krays once relied on fear and fists, the new generation relied on numbers, connections and silence. Violence was still there, but it no longer wore suits or smiled for cameras. Yet the myth of the Krays refused to die. Books were written, plays performed, films produced, each one adding another layer of legend. Some painted them as cold-blooded killers, others as tragic anti-heroes. Their story became entertainment, stripped of its real cost. For the people who lived through it, though, it wasn't a myth. It was a time when fear ruled the East End, when men disappeared without warning, when silence kept you alive. But time dulls pain, and soon the story became just that, a story. In prison, Reggie watched his legend grow with a strange mix of pride and disgust. He gave interviews through letters, sometimes defending himself, sometimes confessing more than he intended. He spoke of honor, of loyalty, of rules that no longer existed. But between the lines, there was a man trying to make sense of his life. He knew that whatever they had built, it had destroyed everything they ever cared about. He had lost Francis, lost his freedom, lost his city. All he had left was the memory of what used to be power. Ronnie, meanwhile, drifted deeper into his own world. He believed he was still in charge, still feared, still respected. Visitors described his room filled with letters, clippings and old photos, a shrine to a time that no longer existed. He talked about plans, about getting out, about running London again. But everyone knew those were fantasies. His health declined, his mind fractured further, but his pride never faded. Even in Broadmoor, he introduced himself as Mr. Ronnie Kray, a gentleman of London. Their mother, Violet, remained loyal to the end. She visited whenever she could, treating them not as criminals, but as her boys. For her, they were still the sons who once protected her from the chaos of the East End. When she died in 1982, both brothers were granted permission to attend her funeral. The image of the twins, handcuffed, walking behind their mother's coffin, surrounded by guards, became another haunting symbol. Two powerful men reduced to prisoners mourning the only person who ever truly loved them. After her death, Reggie changed. The toughness faded. He began speaking more openly about regret. He wrote that his biggest mistake wasn't the murders or the crimes, but the belief that fear could ever replace respect. "If I could turn back time," he said in one letter, "I'd choose peace. But life doesn't offer second chances, especially to men like me." Those words marked a quiet acceptance that their empire had been built on nothing but illusion. Ronnie's end came first. Years of medication and isolation took their toll. On March 17th, 1995, he died of a heart attack at 61, still in Broadmoor. The news hit Reggie harder than he expected. For all their fights, for all the chaos Ronnie caused, Reggie had never known life without him. He called him my twin, my other half, the only one who really knew me. The authorities allowed him to attend the funeral under armed escort. Reporters watched as Reggie, thinner and greyer, stood by the grave, head bowed. The streets were lined with onlookers, some paying respect, others watching the end of an era. For a moment, London remembered what it had once feared. After that, Reggie's last years were marked by reflection. He gave a few interviews, always careful with his words. He spoke less about power and more about forgiveness. Some said he turned to faith, others said it was guilt. Whatever it was, the man who once ran nightclubs and demanded silence was now gentle, even soft-spoken. The fire that drove him was gone, replaced by a tired honesty. He remained in prison for over 30 years, a living ghost of a world long gone. Younger inmates treated him with curiosity, a legend, a relic, a man whose stories didn't fit the modern world. When asked about his past, he would shrug and say, "It was another time." He rarely glorified it, but he never completely condemned it either. To the end, he remained loyal to the idea that family came first, even when that loyalty had destroyed everything. In 2000, Reggie Kray was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Knowing he had little time left, he was released on compassionate grounds after serving 33 years. For the first time since the 1960s, he walked freely through the streets of England, though nothing looked familiar. The city that once feared him now barely recognized him. He spent his final weeks quietly, surrounded by a few close friends, giving one last interview in which he said, "We weren't the monsters they said we were, but we weren't saints either. Maybe somewhere in between." Reggie died on October 1st, 2000, at the age of 66. The brothers were buried side by side in Chingford, next to their mother. Even in death, they couldn't be separated. Their funerals drew crowds, old faces from the East End, journalists, curious onlookers, and even a few former gangsters. It wasn't respect that filled the air that day, just fascination. The world had outgrown them, but their legends still lingered. Years later, films would bring their names back to the screen. Younger audiences would discover the Krays through actors, not history books, but no movie ever captured the real story. The long decay, the loneliness, the fear they created but couldn't escape. The truth was simpler. They were two brothers born into violence, raised by survival, and destroyed by their own need to be more than what they were. Their downfall wasn't written by the police, or the courts, or even the rivals they crushed. It was written the moment they began to believe their own myth, that they were untouchable, that the rules didn't apply. Power built on fear always collapses, because fear fades. Once people stop being afraid, there's nothing left. The Krays thought they were writing history, but history wrote them out. The city they ruled forgot their names in the noise of new crimes, new money, new fame. Yet their story still echoes not as a warning to gangsters, but as a lesson in what happens when pride blinds you to everything else. They were not heroes. They were not victims. They were two men who lived by violence, loved by loyalty, and died surrounded by ghosts. Their story ends not with gunfire, but with silence, the kind that fills a prison cell at night when all the noise of the world disappears. And in that silence lies the real truth. The one television never shows, that behind every legend of power and fear, there's always a man who wishes he could start again. In the end, the Kray twins didn't die in the streets they once ruled. They died in silence, one behind hospital walls, the other in a quiet room, far from the noise of London. The empire they built was gone, the money forgotten, the power meaningless. All that remained were their names whispered in pubs, printed in books, and carved into the city's memory. People still argue about who they really were. Some say they were businessmen who went too far. Others call them cold-blooded killers. But the truth sits somewhere in the middle, buried under decades of myth. They were a product of their time, born into chaos, raised by survival, and destroyed by the belief that fear could last forever. The Krays once said they wanted to be remembered. They got their wish, but not the way they imagined. They're remembered not for their strength, but for their fall for proving that even kings of the underworld can't escape gravity. When the lights fade and the cameras stop, all that's left is the truth. Power fades, fear fades, legends fade, but the consequences, they never do.